that requires a degree of introspection on the leader's own intuitively held values. It's the task of the leader to bring these values to the surface and to confront the private choice that he must make about value preferences and value priorities. This is similar, if you like, to the Socratic idea, know thyself. And from this perspective, the leader may find it appropriate to clarify the value implications of contested values with a clear understanding of what his own values are. In discharging this task, the leader must be amenable to a degree of creative orientation about the fundamental values to which he is objectively committed. This is a difficult task, but there are procedures that can facilitate it. Now, just the question of leadership and social intelligence. Almost all commentators on leadership stress the importance of emotional intelligence as one of the components of good leadership. Emotional intelligence is an impulse driver of the leader's emotional state in social process, and emotional intelligence would probably be a key to a deeper understanding of the leader's relationship to his follower. What is clear is that social intelligence requires communication skills, empathy, compassion, capacity to identify with the needs and aspirations of the follower. And I think Ivo mentioned the notion love thy neighbor, so I would include the ability to generate and sustain affect or affection as an emotional state as an important component of the leader's capacity to lead. Now, just developing rational, original, and creative leadership skills, this is a much more complex undertaking, as indicated below, which I'll mention. The leader must develop skills of problem identification and problem solving. Critical to the problem identification is the mechanism of contextualizing problems as outcomes of society, and even more importantly, the ability to predict them. Problem solving, as indicated below, is going to involve several intellectual skills, and collectively these skills require a form of knowledge integration. Briefly, goal thinking, value thinking, trend thinking, historical thinking, scientific thinking, predictive thinking, and creative thinking. What are the mental processes by which leaders can constructively respond to problems that seem irreconcilable? This is a task that implicates all the intellectual skills I've just mentioned that go with the business of problem solving. But it is especially important in the context of thinking skills that we associate them as well with alternative or creative thinking. One of the former presidents of our academy believed that the mind was largely composed of twin blades for the explanation of meaning and understanding. The component of the mind that deals with logic, and the component of the mind that deals with creativity, which in Freudian terms he believed was connected to the notion of free fantasy. He believed that we could cultivate the method of free fantasy that would unleash solutions to a vast and hopefully constructive reservoir of psychic capacity and potential. This reservoir, he believed, was critical to the emergence of constructive or creative alternatives. Leadership, I've given a catalogue of leadership and the experience of great leaders, which I borrowed partly from Gary. Great leaders such as Jean Monnet, who centuries before had already imagined the idea of a European Union, or Copernicus's radical vision of what the solar system looked like. Aurobindo, who could visualize, long before it happened, the independence of India. Rosa Parks, who triggered the civil rights movement in the United States. Churchill, who, for whatever reasons, whether it was the defense of empire or the defense of Britain or the defense of democracy, emphatically made it clear that we shall never surrender. And during the Depression, Gary has mentioned Roosevelt, who came from the American elite, often considered by many on the right as a traitor to his class, but he made the rather critical point at a critical time that the only thing we had to fear was fear itself, and he said, put your money in the bank and we'll solve at least a significant component of the problem, and so on. Now, problem identification and leadership roles. Whatever we expect of good leadership, it is that good leadership has the intellectual capacity to identify what a problem is and why that problem may be a problem of importance to society and to the public order, globally speaking. In order to identify a problem of importance to society, the leader has to recognize that the problem itself is a product of human relations, of human interaction. And that requires a fairly disciplined method of identifying and contextually locating the problem that represents the challenge to leadership responsibility. This means we've got to have a shorthand method of mapping the context out of which problems emerge. We need to know, if you have an idea of what society looks like, where the problem is in society. Not that it comes out of, but what particular participators, situations, strategies are implicated. And here, some of our WASP fellows developed a model implicating human beings' values and value problems. And these I will briefly summarize, but the model of social process from which we derive the problems and where they are located on the map would include, for example, the identification of the participators, who are the players, and what are the problems implicating the different roles of the different players in that social universe. Then the most important, but I think controversial, would be what are the perspectives of the participators? And that really gets into the personality. In Freudian terms, you'd say id, ego, superego. But our colleagues refine that in terms of the perspective of identity. What is the perspective of identity, be it national, ethnic, professional, or whatever, but what are the perspectives of identity that motivate and create a problem or a challenge that has social importance? Second, with the development of ego psychology, we could basically look at the ego as a demander of the rational values of the person. Does the person want better participation in corporate decision-making, or worker decision-making, or political decision-making, or family decision-making, or whatever it is? But the perspective of demand is forgotten, but one of the most crucial components of social organization. A society that involves no claiming for values is static. It is just a bunch of sheep being led to the slaughter. So when you look at a society and there's no one claiming anything, it's really bad news. I'm not quite sure of this, but Alexander can tell us that in the immediate aftermath of the communist regime, one of the difficulties was getting ordinary people to claim. Because in communism, if you were claiming anything, you were a subversive. You see, so I just mentioned that also. So identity. And then demands for expectations. You can want things, but you still have to put that into the context of what the norms of society are. Freud would have used loosely the superego, but we call that expectations. Okay? So that's the whole problem then of the human subjectivity is still today a major problem for modern economists. They say they want to look at what people want, but then they substitute their own vision for what people want from what they think people want. But that's the great challenge. And to map that is a crucial thing. And it's important for leaders not only to understand their own perspectives of identity, demand, and expectation, but for the followers as well. And then from that we move to bases of power. Society is an inert. And when we look at power, it's not just governmental power. Virtually any value can serve as a base of power. You can use affection as a base of power. You can use skill, education, wealth as a base of power. So power is much more omnipresent in terms of the way in which the strategies of social action are mobilized. And there are problems with it. If the participators have no access to any base of power, they're disempowered. That means we can identify precisely what the possible axes of power are for them and how they can be mobilized, or how a leader can maximize those possibilities for the followers. And then we come to things happen in some place in space, in some place in time, and we frequently have to ask ourselves, what is the degree of institutionalization of power? Is power so institutionalized as in a totalitarian state that nobody else has any power? You know? So we have to look at that very carefully, where the problems are situationally, and people may behave completely differently if there's a crisis and if there's no crisis. And if there's a crisis, there may be great opportunities for malevolence or for benign goodness. We have to be aware of those kinds of problems as well, the problems created by crisis. And of course, geography is another factor. And then, at least I'm an international lawyer, so one of the most important things that we have to grapple with consistently are the problems of strategies. What are the strategies that are appropriate? Do we prefer persuasion to coercion, minor coercion, major coercion? Do we prefer economic sanctions, or propaganda, or diplomacy, or negotiation, or whatever? But there's a whole range of problems that just can emerge from the strategies of action that are accessible to the leader, to the followers, and to the antagonists. And then what are the outcomes of all of this? And the outcomes, of course, are going to be largely out of society, fundamentally the problems of the competition for power. That's one. And so it seems to me that if you can contextualize the problems in terms of all of these markers that represent certain critical points in social process, we have a much more realistic sense of what exactly the problems are that we have to respond to. Now, finally, and most importantly, I think, and forgotten, is that this is the kind of model that can help you predict problems. And man, we'll be better off if we can predict the problems before they happen, because we can think through solutions, in anticipation of what occurs there. So I want to stress the importance of problem prediction for leadership. Now, I want to just take us then from that to the intellectual skills that we need for problem solving. And these are just formulated at a general level. Assuming you have a problem, no matter where it is on the scale, the problem is ultimately about a contestation for values. Somebody's disempowered and somebody's excessively empowered, and you're trying to work that through, or whatever it is. And so, from the context and problems, the first major intellectual task for the leader is the capacity to clarify values. And also to come to terms with his own values and to determine whether those contestations have some congruence with what his intuitively held values are. And so that remains a problem as to what ultimately the objective value is that's the most desirable, that should guide our problem-solving task. And I'll leave that, but we can discuss that. That's your first intellectual quality then, is value clarification, ability to think normatively and to clarify what people want. Not necessarily what they say they want, but what they really want. And second, how have we handled this in the past? How have our decision makers responded to this in the past? Or our intellectuals or whatever. And we call that a trend. We need to know what we did in the past with this type of problem and whether that was worth a damn or not. Trend thinking. History, Alexander will tell you, is important. And then, why was the trend a trend? What factors shaped the way in which decision makers operated in the 19th century, the 18th century, the early 20th century? What were the causes and what were the consequences of those decision-making interventions? We could call that an element of scientific thinking. So we've got goal thinking, trend thinking, scientific thinking, and now we come to something that's even more controversial. If we don't do anything, what is the most reasonable projection into the future that you can make, given no intervention whatsoever? Now, you can do this in many different ways, but the way I do it is I try to project a developmental construct. And I ask myself, from this given set of trends and conditions, what is the most miserable prediction you can have in terms of the values you clarified, okay? That's a possibility. And what's the most optimistic future construction that you can have from the same set of trends and conditions? So it's not that the prediction is causally determined, but the possibilities are there from a given set of trends and conditions, the worst case and the best case scenario. And then finally, and that's predictive thinking. Finally, creative thinking. If you want to get to the best case and avoid the worst case, you need some creativity. You need to think alternatively. And here, what Laszlo suggested and some others was, you have to have some capacity to free fantasize, to let the thing maybe percolate overnight in your head. And somebody said, at 4 o'clock in the morning, I wake up, I have a solution, And what we believe, but we can't prove it scientifically, is that creative side of the mind does have a reservoir of psychic capacities of almost unlimited, boundaries. So you can't always say what's going to come out is going to be great, but you have a good chance of something constructive coming out that facilitates the strategy or the alternative of moving away from the worst case and approximating the best case. Now, those were just some tools of problem solving, but the central point is they require knowledge integration. You can't just think in little boxes and hope they don't work. And I saw some of this in your paper as well, so slightly different language, same objective. Finally, if these tools, which are more intellectual, and so I suppose the decision making has to have some people who can help him integrate these different intellectual skills. And then the question, of course, is decision making. A kind of intervention that requires decision making, hopefully informed by these intellectual tasks that give you a clear picture of what it is you're deciding about. And I can't go through all of this, but put it this way. Our colleagues in the academy work hard at the architecture of decision making. It doesn't matter. Are you making a decision to apply to a particular university? Have you tried to unpack what's inside your head when you've actually made that decision? Or any decision. And if you are, you may do this with exquisite skill or with rudimentary intuitive understandings, but you go through some form of intelligence predicate. In other words, you know what the facts are. For example, in your illustration, we got what was it, 500 billion? I can't remember. But, you've got some basic facts upon which to react. And then, if you are in that process, and you then have to decide tentatively that you have some decision-making response, but you also realize that it has to be not only promoted within yourself, but also for a target audience. So you would look at the intelligence and then look tentatively at what it is you're going to promote. a promotion would be critical, and at some levels, the ideas of good leadership would have to be radically promoted globally. Then we come to something that's not so well understood by lay people, but it's the notion of prescription. Better understood by lawyers than by others, but fundamentally, a decision is really, if you like, a form of prescription. In other words, you're spelling out, if it's law, a rule, a principle, a standard, something that's communicable in language that has a certain binding or mandatory quality to it. Once you've created that rule, you have to invoke it. You have to apply it to given circumstances. And invocation then would be another decision-making function. Once you've invoked it, it's a specific question of application. Here are the contestants or the organizations, and you've got to learn the mechanics or the technology of application. And once you've applied it, you terminate it. And that itself requires certain intellectual skills that, yes, the decision goes so far, or it's an example to go further, or whatever, but termination would be there. And finally, most critical of all decision makers ought to be sitting back and appraising what they've done. What are the consequences? Does it work? Does it not work? Should we reevaluate it? Was the prescription too wide, too narrow? Was the application insufficiently effective, etc., etc., etc.? Now I could go, books have been written on that, so I've tried to summarize that in 5 minutes, but forgive me. My time's up. Thank you very much.
Gordon, would you like to go next? We have about 5 minutes each, and then it's a short session.
Well, yes. My understanding of the title of the talk is that leadership by thought is that you use an idea, a concept, a plan, and that is, if you like, the power. You don't have power, it's the power based, but use that as the power. And therefore, an example comes to my mind, which is, let's say, very serious effects or consequences for the country in question. It was Professor William Ripke. He was the economic advisor to Adenauer. And he came up with this idea of social market economy. Now, I thought it was partly because he said of this tremendous division between capital and labor. And that was precisely actually not to have them sort of almost like enemies, but rather actually joining. So that was, of course, then with the codetermination law that came, that was pushed by Americans, for actually they had different intentions, with the representatives of labor on the board of the corporation, we kind of reinforced that thing. So that is, and then when I actually read the questions after that, how do original thinkers transcend the common boundaries imposed by conventional thought? Well, if I dare say that, I would say by dreaming. Because in dreams, there are emotions, there are feelings expressed, etc. And, it is the easiest way to forget about really what is the reality. What is the kind of reality you wish? Now, I would use a very simple example, maybe too simplistic. We ran a competition called Ukraine of Your Dreams. And people from 14 years of age until 82 participated, 550 people. And I remember one 14-year-old girl saying, in Ukraine of my dreams, people will smile at each other. Now, it struck me and I stayed in contact with that girl. What happened? Actually, that since she won one of the prizes, she felt, say, reassured about, let's say, the interest of her dream. And in her own city, in Vinnytsia, she started smiling to people as they were coming by. At first, the reactions were, who is she? What? And then, gradually, they began to smile back at her. And after a while, they started smiling to each other. So this young girl actually created at least an island of the Ukraine of her dreams. In that city, people were smiling to each other. So, but that was the outcome of first dreaming about her. So I wanted to use this, but doesn't just apply to children or things of that kind. Now, the question was, by what mental processes do leaders think are synthesize and unify apparently disparate aspects of knowledge? I think that one has to have a broad range of knowledge, not necessarily everything in depth, but yes, it's very useful for people to actually have a depth of knowledge in some field, and then go horizontally and know something about others, but more important to understand the relationship between the different the fields of knowledge, different parts of knowledge. And I think in that way, you see, you can sort of transcend. Now, on C, we said what application might these thought processes have on the development of transformational leaders. There I can think of the example of Jack Welch, the head of General Electric. Now, I know it because I happen to be a consultant in the company. He perceived the need. It is the need perception. He perceived the need for the company actually to really grow, but what did he do very quickly? He bypassed a couple of layers of the hierarchy, and he met with 49 heads of departments, they call them in GE, not divisions, departments. And he said a very simple thing to each one. Now, you have to be first or second in the world in what you are doing, or else you will not be. It was a very simple message. Now, he didn't tell them how to be the first or the second, he set the judgment. Now, then actually the question is how the company actually could grow through that too, was that General Electric had 80% of their market in the United States, 80%. Yet they had tremendous range of technical know-how and had enormous enormous amount of money. So it was obvious that the only way that they could actually change that is go international. So that was the issue, that was the challenge, how to induce them to go international, how to facilitate to go international. At any rate, what happened, you know the end, because he started with $50 billion capitalization when he ended up with $500 billion. So it was let's say, if you like, a quantum order of magnitude change. But it was actually sort of first that he set a very clear objective, and that he also sensed the perception of need for them to grow, and it was not judged by actually this department. Now, another line, how can the capacity to take the opposite point of view be applied by leaders to address social problems? I think it is by role playing. You mentioned this Austrian medical. You mentioned his name, I forgot. He came up with the role playing when he was advisor to couples in difficulty, and he suggested, you wife now play the role of your husband, and the husband play the role of the wife. The Austrian Freud, exactly. And I think so. The comment on the left, how can these processes be taught? actually, well, by using role-playing method. I mean, most business schools actually are using that as one of the methods actually to understand the point of view. Great role besides the topic.
Thank you both for very interesting comments. Winston, I think you gave us enough for a day to think about. Fortunately, we have another session on decision making. I don't think Donato's worried that you have preempted him because the topic is very big, but maybe you can come back at that time and elaborate further. Actually, we've been talking about the mind of the leader and leadership and thought since yesterday morning. So rather than try to come up with something new, I thought of trying to summarize some of the key points which I think we've heard from many people in different sessions. First, I'm listing 5 points very briefly. My reading of this topic is leaders who really make an impact, one of the things they do differently, they may emote differently, they may relate differently, they may organize and act as in organizations differently, but they also think differently. So what are the characteristics in thinking that might differentiate a really creative, transformational leader? The first I would list is the capacity to take other people's point of view. It sounds so simple and so logical, and yet every time I try it, I realize how difficult it is, really, to concede that there's another point of view and to try to understand another point of view. Lincoln said that maybe for a slightly different reason, but he believed in having all those who disagreed with him in his cabinet. He said, I like to have my enemies close by where I can keep an eye on them. But it was interesting to see that I found the same thing in Churchill, and the same thing in a biography of Gorbachev. The capacity to tolerate contrary points of view, to listen to them, not to shut them out, not to shut them down, and of course, ideally to go further and discover the truth in opposite points of view. We know, for example, that the neoliberals and the Keynesians are absolutely incapable of this, and so are the Democrats and the Republicans. There's no conception that there's a truth on the other side. We're only talking at each other. So I think it's a basic characteristic of leadership and thought. Second point that Winston made, Pierre, your whole presentation comes under this, whether what Ivo calls thinking out of the box or thinking out of compartments. The effective leader really has to be able to see the whole. You called it systemic thinking. It was wonderful. I love all that you said. But that conception in thinking, not just to see things as separate and fragments, which we do in our academic disciplines, which we do in trying to solve problems, which we do in our departments of government, which we do in our corporations. And so it's, as I say, it's so common, we're talking about it, but really to be able to do that in our thinking, that qualifies a leader for making a creative contribution. The third, we talked about it yesterday, is not just to respond to surface trends, and Winston alluded to this in different words, not just to respond to present circumstances and obstacles, but to really look at what we were talking yesterday and in Podgorica as the deep drivers that are underneath the surface that are going to determine things in future. Whether we call it a historical perspective or whatever words you want to use for it. Fourth, and I mentioned this yesterday, not to be blinded by what already exists. Alexander kept emphasizing we have to be focusing on the future, occupying the future, not limited by the past. Not to take what exists today as if it's going to be there, as if there's no way, because of the obstacles, whether it's the veto power of the P5 or whatever else it may be. That was the case in 1989 when we had a Berlin Wall and we had an Iron Curtain and we had incredibly different circumstances than 2 years later. And as Alexander said, to be able to see beyond what exists. And finally, Ivo and I wrote an article a couple of years ago for Cadmus. We called it Recognizing Unrecognized Genius. And this came out of a project by another group to try to identify geniuses before they have become famous. And in our article, we were asking ourselves, we were looking at the thought processes of what we call genius. And of course, in this article, the focus was on intellectual issues. But I think it applies much more broadly than just to intellectual issues, that the transformational leader in thought has the capacity to reconcile opposites. We see things as opposites, as contraries, and to recognize that the contraries are really complements. That was the word, Ivo, we arrived at in Podgorica a couple of days ago. It's not just a compromise or a balance between things, because we always try to compromise. We always try to take two things that we think are incompatible and, well, you give a little and I give a little. And there's many famous stories, one of them attributed to Emperor Akbar, that two women came quarreling that they both owned the baby, and the emperor said, it's very quick, simple, we'll divide the baby in half. How do you reconcile things that appear to be contradictions? I alluded yesterday briefly to two examples which have been very impressive to me. It looked to Lincoln, it looked to everybody during the American Civil War that you can either have freedom for the slaves or you can have unity for the country. And yet he found a way to reconcile them. George Washington, he had to exercise authority. He did exercise authority, but he also found a way to self-impose restraints on the authority, the restraints of a constitution, the restraints of rule of law. And I think that's a fifth very powerful characteristic of leaders, that they don't see things as either or. They don't see things as opposites. They see things in a continuum, and they also see there are levels of reality where what appear as opposites can be reconciled. I think we have 15 minutes left. Let's open it for comments.
Thank you, Gary. Thank all of you for extremely thought-provoking discussion. I wanted to just to address the issue of this compromise in the leadership, different ways of leadership. You know, in my previous life, I was involved in some negotiations on disarmament and arms control. And, I wanted to share you because it looks like an exact example of what I want to say. You know, there were incidents, for instance, on the negotiations on the intermediate ballistic missiles in Geneva, and at that time, the negotiations, of course, we had the head of the delegation, etc., and it was a discussion, as always, in the diplomatic negotiations about different, let me say, integrative bargaining packages, meaning that there were frames in which different parts of the element were moved between. We can quid pro quo on this issue, or we could use this package, or we can link this package to another package, for instance, the intermediate range ballistic missiles to the defensive structure, etc., etc. And the bargaining, I would call it, it's sort of the entrepreneurial bargaining. We are talking with them. And then at some point, Gorbachev comes in directly and says, okay, I don't want this bullshit anymore. I want an agreement by tomorrow morning. It was not an authoritarian thing. What he addressed, he said, we have changed our approach to peace. We have changed our approach to security. Use this as a platform for the discussions. And in my judgment, this is exemplifies the difference between the usual forms of negotiations with the search of the compromise and compatibility of different contradictory issues, and changing completely the, let me say, system of thought, creating new model, creating new ideological, sometimes, framework which changes the approach of the people engaged on this. And in fact, what I will say, that intellectual leadership usually creates intellectual capital, because it is about new base, new approach, within which the traditional forms, they do not need any or usual kind of synchronization or compromise, search of a compromise. You know, after Gorbachev and Reagan in Geneva said that in 85 that the nuclear war is not imaginable, and it should not ever take place. It changed completely the paradigms that in which the delegation started to look at the land. So that's one thing.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a very stupid question. I know how to wash my body. I know how to train my muscle. I know the basic hygiene, for the body. What's the basic hygiene for the mind? Because if I'm using my mind and my brain to get thoughts, how do I train my mind?
Well, why don't we take the questions and then we can come back and
very well done, and also the comments I heard. I heard you saying, Winston, that leaders need to know what people want. And definitely true, I agree with that. I agree also that an effective leader should actually distinguish from what people that are not in touch with themselves say they want, and what are the basic needs of a nation or a community. A lot of the problems of a non-sustainable planet come from mass neurosis of having a consumption. This Time magazine this week has a big article, 4 pages dedicated to consultant and firm that have exploded in the United States and that help people to throw away, because they clutter their house. Clearly, people, have a hysterical consumption patterns because they want to feel an emptiness that they cannot, by consumption fill. And so people want to look always young, sexy, and attractable. But, that is a defense mechanism to feeling the basic need to feel secure and lovable. And for people that don't feel in their bones the right to exist. So a leader should be really discriminating between the false needs and between the wants and real human needs. Also, so a leader should be able to discriminate effectively between problems that need a solution, an effective solution, or chasing, without any hope of success, predicaments that are not problems, and so there is no solution. For example, 75% of our health expenses are dedicated to people that are getting older and older, and we invest in all our resources to have life have more quantity, while we totally disattend promoting people quality. Another thing is that a real leader, like Gary was saying, has to be able to reconcile different opposing systems. And so basically we have in many parliaments, certainly in Italy, actually the opposite example, where in television leaders of different parties always offend each other, interrupt others when they're speaking of that. So I think we should have leaders just be role model, because nowadays world they usually have really bad manners and they're role models to not respect the other person's space even when they're speaking.
Thank you. Well, I think we entered this complex environment now of negotiations, and beyond decision making, and we are now entering also the capital almost to the start of negotiations. And in this sense, I want to make reference to two qualities or two abilities that the leader should display in complex environments and in difficult negotiations. One is the search for a conducive environment. I think this is always the case. I mean, the importance, I'm sure that all of you that took part in important negotiations know how important it is to find a conducive environment. And this environment can be a room like this one, or it could be a big forum. It's not necessarily the intrinsic characteristic of the place in general, but has to be adapted to the circumstances. So I just want to offer you an example that I lived myself through the negotiations that we handled long ago in Laayoune between Morocco and Polisario for this very long quarrel, as you know, independence or no independence of Western Sahara. And we handled the first direct talks in '93 between these two factions, you can say, one government and an independence group. Well, the question was where to handle, where to take place. This, of course, we had the capital at our disposal, the city at our disposal, but you had a delegation coming from Mauritania, we had a delegation coming from, elsewhere, and someone is still residing in his own country. So the thing is that the place itself, the city itself, was embellished with a lot of portraits of the King of Morocco, Hassan II, and obviously the opponents did not like that. So the conducive environment in this case that the representative Secretary General found, the same Colonel was mentioned yesterday, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Pakistan, was his own street in the hotel. That was the only place where we could take out the portraits of the King of Morocco, because that's the only place where he did not cause an offense to anybody, and that became a suitable and conducive environment, also physical environment. Again, there is also the emotional space that you create around it, but the conducive physical environment is also important. The other element that I wanted to raise again as an example is face-saving devices. Again, in any negotiation, as you know, face-saving becomes an important element, because there are always moments in which one party or another may fall into contradiction or may fall in a position of weakness. Now, of course, if you, as good leader, you want to negotiate and you want to reconcile positions, as Gary was saying, and this is extremely important, you have to avoid the fact that one party becomes embarrassed or feels like, they are losing out on the ground. So in that case, the important is sometimes to move the barrier, to move the threshold of the compromise. Again, this is a sophisticated tool that can be applied in different circumstances. I'm not going to bring a specific example for that. But I think it's the ability of the leader, if he is a negotiator in this case, is to find a common terrain and to lower the threshold of the compromise on a specific situation. Might be really something menial, not necessarily the core of the issue itself. But that gives you the possibility of progressively aiming at the compromise or solutions that you're seeking. I mean, reconciling positions, that's what I would say.
Yeah. Global investment capital in the name of multinationals are normally the ones that are going to governments. I don't speak about private companies, I talk about political leaders. And what happens is that those political leaders would normally, obviously, cooperate and obviously introduce legislation to favor whatever has been gained. What I would like to know is what methodology does one utilize in order to get the people who appoint governments to further their interests to buy into the new concept of religion. Because in essence, it goes against their interests.
Well, I'll try to respond to those. Let me start out by saying the question of reconciling opposites. I mean, that's really the fundamental question, is to find out exactly what values are in contention, and they're obviously in contention, so that's what the leader has to confront. Now, I did recommend a number of procedures to facilitate that, but still, I think at the end of the day, the leader is probably confronted with his own value preference. Now, the way he applies it may be very nuanced, but there's almost an inescapable problem of having to make a choice. And the question then is there an objective way in which he can take his own values and provide a foundation for where he intends to go? And people differ about that. They say it's too subjective, you can't really do it. But then I'm not quite sure what the alternative is. The predominant value implicated in the works of Sen, Dworkin, and our own Harold Aswell from our academy see in the aggregate of the values that are connected with some version of human rights that there is a fundamental postulate of human dignity. And in effect, however, we can't reach that with any particular, but your judgment ultimately based on trends, conditions, predictions, is that you want something that approximates the best vindication of that principle on a global basis. But I realize that's a contested idea, and we could take that further if you wanted to. Then the other question was the hygiene of the mind. And, well, in the conventional sense, the mere fact that I focused on what people want didn't preclude the idea that those wants have to be at least juxtaposed, reconciled, and understood in terms of the fundamental expectations, the dominant moral feelings in the community, the dominant law or fundamental law or international law or whatever, so that the personality isn't unconstrained, demands are not unconstrained, but they have to confront the principle of social reality within which the demand is being made.
Can I add something to that?
Yes, Paul.
Yes, to Philip's question. Well, the hygiene of the mind, of the brain, I think it may be an answer. Curiosity, that is asking oneself all the time the questions. Why, what, how? And I think this is like kind of having a good shower for the rest of the body. That's,
I just have one last comment.
I wasn't finished.
You
but
finished, then you finished.
Okay, all right. But the other aspect of the hygiene of the mind is the, I think, agreed upon notion that from the very earliest of periods of birth, nutrients, to the evolution of adulthood, there are phases people go through. And one of the least understood is the child's sense of time. So that what to an adult may be normal may be an intense deprivation to the child. And the consequence of this is that these become stored up in the unconscious as impulses. In moderation, it's the impulse that drives leadership. In excess, it may drive mental illness. So, in a sense, a great deal of what we inherit happens in very innocuous practices that we don't really fully understand or appreciate. Additionally, there is a phase known as the Oedipal phase, where the person has to go through the mother as a love object, the love object lost, and the father as a conscience. So that's called the Oedipal phase. Why it's important is that it teaches the organism to manage gratification, to delay gratification, and not to have gratification drive the personality. On the other side, capitalism thrives on intense gratification, impulses that drive to acquire, to purchase, and whatever. I don't know that we'd actually be willing to solve that as a matter of public policy, but certainly impulse gratification has a fit with the market, whether we like it or not. That's
I'd like to go back to Ivo. Please, you go ahead.
Your question of hygiene of the mind and hygiene of the brain actually maybe are even two slightly different things. By brain, I think we conceive of the physical apparatus we have over here. By mind, we comprehend a much broader concept that exists, which we much less understand. Brain, we can do a lot of technical things, measure electromagnetic waves, connections, neurons, this and that. So it's a much simpler way. On a very superficial view, we could say that brain is a system, and therefore there is certain final capacity that it has, and therefore you should try to clean it from time to time to reset certain things. Now, as Alexandra pointed out yesterday, speaking about her own various duties and so on, she just simply said, yes, I can do all of this. I don't know why you have other students who do 10 times less. So it seems that our brain is not just like a box that is filled or not filled, not filled or half filled or something like that. That by filling it more and more, you can hopefully even provide more. It could very well be that, as a matter of fact, you clean, quote unquote, your brain and your mind by extra activities, sometimes totally disconnected, because then you may be able to really, the phrase that we often use, think out of the box totally. However, there is always a danger. One of the things that we very frequently address to, and is related to the hygiene of the mind and the brain, is the question of prejudices. Now, what are the prejudices? There are certainly one prejudice which tells us we cannot do it. Following Barack Obama, we can, right? We can. However, not everything. There are objective laws. Luckily, most of these laws that we cannot do anything about are laws of physics. And we don't care about them, you know. They are trivial. Yeah, I mean, they're trivial. We don't worry about that. But there are some other obviously laws, you know, that we treat it as if they are solid rock, and they are definitely not solid rocks. One obviously was the rock that, you know, frequently expressed saying we all have to die. Oh, maybe this will disappear, you know, as the thing, and maybe we will be already, we live considerably longer, not just individuals, but almost all of the people live much longer. So yes, there are certain things that are there. The other thing which is very important for us, particularly in the connection with leadership, is most of the leadership concept for a long time was restricted to a reasonably small community. Now is more and more the entire world. You influence the entire world, and you have to be very, very aware of the fact that you cannot keep it just in the small family. You are going to have adverse effect. And something that could not be dangerous for a small family might be extremely dangerous and unacceptable for the world as such. So there are a number of things that your question is very, very tricky, and as I said, when you go to the mind, it might be even more difficult than when you restrict just to the physical things between our ears.
Last question.
First question, John, you elaborate a bit more what you said, or not elaborate, but complement it. What I use, I can share with you what I use to reset my brain or to delete my brain. It's possible, it's feasible, and it's not controllable, of course, not measurable, but I've been practicing meditation for 30 years now. So, to tell you one little story, at the mountains, summer camp, meditation camp, we had 500 people together from all over the world, and the Sufi master, who I had the privilege to learn from, told us, let's make with 500 people for 1 week a novelty. Let's be in silence with 500 people for 1 week, from the morning to the evening. Say no word to each other. So I can assure you, after that week, your brain is washed, but in a good way. And you get rid of all your illusions, all your preconditioning, and when you are, there are specific methods to release all the so-called stress, because stress is also in the mind. That stress doesn't exist, it's in the mind. You can release it by just a click of a second by breathing. Just a click of a second, you can release all the stress by breathing, or by listening to the birds and what they're telling you. And that's also a good way of releasing stress, is listening to the birds and to the wind. And this morning, when I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, was a wonderful wind, and blow everything away, so I'm fully fresh now.
And the birds?
The birds are singing.
At 3 o'clock?
Of course they are. I have to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning. You can hear them.
Can I just finish with, that's not basically, but say that what last speaker did actually then goes to the new paradigm that has been discussed for so many days, and the importance of psychology and psychological practice. In practice, there are many people in this world, the majority of them, who wouldn't be able to do what he has because they do not have the know-how or the ability to grasp that concept in a matter of a week. I'm sure 500, a lot of people just were not able to keep quiet, so that they were
because they were disciplined.
or they were probably chosen. But again, just to get to important issue that I want to raise, and that is the importance of psychology and psychiatry and social issues when one gets to the criteria that comprise the issue. Yeah.
Alberto has the last word.
There is a lot of research on how people can learn to become healthy, also how people can become effective leaders, and how effective leaders can become after to create the environment and the relational condition to have prevention and manage the conflict on win-win solution. So we have proof that this is done and can be done. If it can be done to a larger scale, it depends probably on the power issue more than if it's feasible.
Would these improve on the 5 intellectual tasks that I recommend problem solving?
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, we really need to